You will then have Labour having to work out how it deals with a Donald Trump presidency. It's worth bearing in mind that Keir Starmer spoke to Donald Trump for the first time, full stop, yesterday. In the wake of that, it was a very brief call. He condemned the violence and he wished him well, wishing him a speedy recovery. But that's it. They hadn't spoken before.
Let's talk to Steve Swinford. We're going to talk about political discourse. It's been a theme of our programme all morning. The argument being made by some Republicans in America is that the way we talk about politics has fanned the flames of violence and has contributed to the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. Let's talk to Steve Swinford now. Steve, morning to you.
Good morning.
This is probably, I mean, America has its own history of political violence, it has its own history with guns, it has its own history of assassination of presidential candidates and actual presidents. So that's not very familiar to us. But this question of, has politics changed its tone? Has it coarsened? Have we lost the ability to do politics properly? As a political editor, can you sense something like that?
I think it has become much more caustic. It did, particularly after Brexit. I remember that around that period, there were various extraordinary language around, like really horrible language around Theresa May, as there was a backlash over Brexit, talk of kind of hangings, a lot of it coming from Tory MPs at the time that were opposed to what she was doing. And it feels like it kind of, the social media and everything else has amplified it. It's all got kind of much more toxic. And we've just had an election campaign where a lot of the headline debates were the traditional, they're going to raise taxes, or you're going to kind of raise taxes, that kind of stuff. But actually the broader picture, some of the stuff that was going on the ground was absolutely disgusting that MPs were being subjected to in some really horrible local contests. So yes, it does feel like it is getting worse, and it feels like social media is amplifying an existing problem.
And how do we fix it? We had Stella Creasy on saying the police weren't willing to step in when there was when people were shouting child killer at her. I don't know how you fix this, because maybe that's just the way society has gone. Social media is a live thing and politics is at the sharp end of that.
I think people need to be reminded of what's at stake. It's really stark to me that as MPs are being inducted, one of the things that they're getting downstairs in Portcullis House is there's a door with an alarm system. They're being taught about all the security measures for their homes. And actually, this is a very real thing, and it's a very pervasive threat to MPs that they're having to deal with on a daily basis. And I often think that MPs kind of get dehumanized. They're all people. They've got differing views. They've got differing approaches, but they're all people. And that kind of sometimes gets forgotten in the kind of hurly-burly of political rhetoric. But look, this is for everyone involved in politics. It's an issue for everyone. And that includes people like me, Stig, people like you. We've all got to be really careful. And we are really careful with our language, because it's a big issue.
And presumably MPs as well. I mean, we've been talking about David Lammy this morning. Now, there was a period where he was just a backbencher and he wanted to appeal to his tribe. So he called Donald Trump a Nazi-loving sociopath. And now he's foreign secretary and wants to have some sort of formal relationship with the White House. It's tricky, isn't it? Because social media is how people communicate, and people now communicate much more demotically than they used to. But can you be an MP and avoid that? Do you have to be an MP and avoid that, do you think?
I think you have to be really careful. I think everyone you needs to use social media in a measured way, but often it just becomes a kind of slanging match on an evening. As a reporter, I'm always thinking about how I can make sure that anything that I put out on social media is completely neutral and couldn't be seen by one side or another as being favourable. And MPs are also have to be quite careful in what they're saying. I think during the election campaign, we got into a state at various points where both of the leaders, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, were accusing one another of lying. And I think when you get to that stage, it gets to a kind of really difficult period of political discourse. But the best thing about the election, I think, was that after it had happened, Rishi Sunak paid a very warm tribute to Keir Starmer and to his family for supporting him through the difficult times of an election campaign, and vice versa, that they actually put down the cudgels and that there was a kind of like completely unpartisan recognition of what they'd been through. And that is the best of politics. And we probably do need a bit more of that.
Well, Rishi Sunak is an interesting figure. Now, what does he now do? Because how long does he want to stick around or otherwise? We had Andrew Mitchell on, who's now the Shadow Foreign Secretary. He told us his view about what Rishi Sunak should do, and he thinks he should stay on until a permanent leader is elected.
an interim leader is not, in my view, the best option. The best option is to seek to persuade Rishi to remain. It's not an enormously long time in the scope of things. It's probably till mid to end November. And while I completely understand his possible reticence.
Will he do this, Steve? Because you and I have talked a lot about the timescale for this, and November, December seems to be the likely time there will be a new leader. Can anyone reasonably get up for work like Rishi Sunak will have to, go to PMQs, have a row with Keir Starmer surrounded by 400 of his most faithful MPs on the back of a terrible defeat? Is it possible to just suck it up and do that? Do you think Rishi Sunak has that in him?
I think it's quite unlikely. I think he's willing to go till conference. He's willing to go till September, October. But now they all seem to be talking about kind of December or January as the kind of timeline for this. And I think that is a big ask for him to take the party through party conference when the main candidates, which will turn into a kind of beauty parade, but they'll all be ripping chunks out of him. We've already had one shadow cabinet meeting where that's already been the case. And I think it is asking a lot of him to do that. But obviously, Andrew Mitchell knows him very well. He seems to think that he will be recommending that he does so. But I think the reality of it is that he'll probably want to be moving on.
So who's the
interim leader?
So who is that? Because I asked Andrew Mitchell if he would be it. He said no. Ian Duncan-Smith seems to be the slightly left field candidate. Won his seat again in a surprise because Labour split the vote. Quiet man of politics, steady hand. Is that possible? A brief return for IDS?
I think he would be up for it in principle, and he's also like kind of he is one of the most extraordinary results of this election campaign. He was given a 1% chance of retaining his seat by the exit poll. He retained it by incumbency. So a lot of Tory MPs of those that remain are kind of respecting of that. And yes, Ian comes from kind of particular political wing of the party, but he has transformed into a grandee. He's much bigger than that now, and he's got some. So I think there is a world where someone like Ian could act as an interim leader with good faith from the leadership candidates.
Is there anyone else that springs to mind? Because I couldn't really think of anybody else.
There's not that many. People are also talking about David Davis as a possibility. There's a few other names that are kind of in the mill, but there aren't that many kind of unpartisan people. And that's the issue. It's a small party now. Yeah. So if you're a leadership candidate, you need every vote you can get.
And just before you go, Steve, you're a wise political figure. Do you feel that moment Donald Trump stood bloodied, unbowed, hands raised in the air? Does your political instinct suggest that's an image that can take him back to the White House?
I mean, it was a very, very powerful image and a powerful moment, and the political ramifications of that are huge. And you can already see that with this shift of tone he's going to do away from the attack speech and to something more unifying. So I think there's a very good chance it does exactly that. And you will then have Labour having to work out how it deals with a Donald Trump presidency. It's worth bearing in mind that Keir Starmer spoke to Donald Trump for the first time, full stop, yesterday. In the wake of that, it was a very brief call. He condemned the violence and he wished him well, wishing him a speedy recovery. But that's it. They hadn't spoken before that. So Labour has a lot of work to do to build bridges with the Republican Party and with Donald Trump's putative administration.
Steve, great to speak to you as ever. That's Steve Swinford, the political editor of The Times. I don't want to say that sound heartless when I say this, but there is something, and you heard it in your conversation with Lisa Nandy, there's something legitimising about an assassination attempt, actually. Because I think Lisa Nandy and Labour generally would be holding Donald Trump, even though they've got to work with him, they'll be holding him at arm's length. But when something like this happens, they just bring the arm a little bit closer, it strikes me. And that's if he takes that tone, this idea of some people might not like me, but now I'm going to be more statesman-like, that may be and that may be successful. People may say, well, we'll forget everything else that you've done, Donald, or we'll downplay everything you've done. We won't no longer call you a fascist or a felon or a sex abuser, two of which are certainly true, one of which is a debating point. Does this actually alter how liberals regard Donald Trump, I wonder?
I think it's a really interesting point, because I think it sticks in the craw of the throat of a liberal person to not have empathy and sympathy for somebody whose life has been threatened in such a way. I mean, it's just not a position that a liberal could have, is it? So I can see that it then becomes very confusing. And obviously, I think it is human nature to want to believe that a close brush with death can change people.
Yeah.
So perhaps there's a hopeful thought, that this brings a dissolute man to his senses.
I've seen Democrat people in America, liberals in America, very angry that conversation is even being had. It really winds them up about that.
And of course it would do, because the charge sheet has long stated what happened before.
It is. And no one is arguing about that. But there's an infirm man on the other side, and now there's a man who defeated death. I mean, the narrative kind of writes itself.
It just is incredible. All of it is incredible. And as many listeners have pointed out this morning, we just do need to keep saying that, 2 people died in the events that took place in Pennsylvania. Obviously, the spectator who was trying to protect his family, and the young man who had taken his rifle onto the roof.